Welcome to Verified Crime Files. Thanks for the support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. And when you're done watching, hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share. Thank you to understand the silence that fell over the Tate household on the evening of November 6, 2025. One must first understand the noise that usually filled it. Bryce Tate was not the kind of teenager who existed in the shadows. At 15, he was a sophomore at Nitro High School in Cross Lanes, West Virginia, a boy who took up space in the best possible way. He was the thud of a basketball against the driveway pavement, the clanking of weights in the school gym, and the easy, respectful yes, sir, and no, ma'am, that had made him a favorite among the parents in his tight-knit community. He was built like a linebacker, but carried himself with a gentle, almost studious demeanor. His father, Adam, often watched him with that specific quiet pride reserved for fathers who see their sons becoming better men than they were. Bryce was extraordinary not because he was an anomaly, but because he was the ideal of American adolescence, athletic, intelligent, and deeply embedded in the fabric of his real-world life. On that particular Thursday, the autumn air in Kanawha County was crisp, the trees stripping down to their gray winter skeletons. It was a day indistinguishable from any other. Bryce had gone to school, navigated the hallways with his usual ease, and perhaps thought about the upcoming basketball season or a lifting session. There were no warning signs, no dark clouds hovering over his head, no brooding diary entries. He was a boy with a future that stretched out before him like a freshly paved highway. But as the afternoon sun began to dip below the West Virginia hills, the physical world Bryce loved, the court, the gym, the dinner table, was about to be eclipsed by a digital one. He retreated to his room, likely tired from the day, and pulled his phone from his pocket. It was a reflex, a muscle memory shared by every teenager in the modern world. He unlocked the screen, unaware that the device in his hand was no longer just a phone, but a loaded weapon pointed directly at his peace of mind. The notification arrived without fanfare. It was just a soft ping or a silent vibration, a digital knock on the door of his private life. On the screen appeared a friend request or perhaps a direct message from a profile that looked disarmingly familiar. The avatar showed a girl, pretty, smiling, and seemingly around his age. The bio likely contained signifiers of a local area, perhaps a reference to a nearby town or a shared interest. For a 15-year-old boy, this was not an intrusion. It was a dopamine hit. In the ecosystem of high school social dynamics, attention from a slightly older girl, she claimed to be 17, was a currency of high value. It validated his status. It made him feel seen. Bryce, trusting and polite by nature, accepted the connection. He had no reason to suspect that the face on the screen did not belong to the person typing the words. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in social engineering, though to Bryce, it just felt like flirting. The person on the other end was not a bot using generic scripts. They were active, responsive, and terrifyingly well-researched. They didn't just say, hey. They asked about his day. They asked about things that required local knowledge. Do you go to Nitro? Do you lift at that gym on the corner? These specific details, crumbs of information likely gleaned from Bryce's public posts or tag photos, were used to construct a bridge of artificial trust. The stranger wasn't a stranger anymore. She was a local. She was part of his tribe. In the quiet of his bedroom, with the house settling down for the evening, Bryce began to type back, his guard lowering with every message. He was being groomed, not over a period of weeks or months, but in real time, by a predator who understood the psychology of a teenage boy better than he understood it himself. As the minutes ticked by, the digital sun began to set on the innocent banter. The girl moved the conversation with practiced efficiency, steering it away from public comments and into the murky waters of private, ephemeral messaging apps, likely Snapchat or Instagram Direct, where messages disappear, creating a false sense of security. The tone shifted perceptibly. The friendly local girl became the bold, flirtatious admirer. She complimented his physique, referencing the gym photos he was so proud of. She made him feel mature, desired, and chosen. This was the love-bombing phase of the attack, condensed into a microdose. The dopamine hits were coming faster now. Bryce was no longer just passing time. He was engaged, his attention fully captured by the glowing rectangle in his hand. Then came the escalation. To solidify the bond and prove her authenticity, the persona sent a photo. It was an intimate image, a nude or semi-nude selfie. To Bryce, this was a monumental gesture of trust. He didn't know that the photo was a stolen artifact, likely harvested from another victim or scraped from the darker corners of the internet. A piece of bait used thousands of times before. Your turn, the message would have implied, perhaps accompanied by a coy challenge or a promise of secrecy. The pressure was subtle but immense. Reciprocity is a powerful social norm. When someone gives us something, we feel compelled to give something back. Bryce, caught in the adrenaline of the moment and the flattery of an older girl, made a decision that would have been unthinkable an hour prior. He snapped a photo. He hit send. The moment the image status changed from sent to opened, the atmosphere in the chat room froze. The warmth, the flirtation, the emojis, it all evaporated instantly. The response was not one of affection or excitement. It was a screenshot. His screenshot. The image he had just taken, now captured and held hostage by the person he thought he liked. The text that followed was cold, transactional, and terrifying. It was a script read by a criminal syndicate operating thousands of miles away, likely from a cramped room in Lagos or Manila, where boys like Bryce were not people, but clients or Magoo. I have your photo, the message read. If you don't pay me, I will send this to everyone. The list followed his friends, his family, his teammates, his school account. They had scraped his follower list while he was busy flirting. They knew exactly who would cause him the most shame. The local girl was gone, replaced by a faceless extortionist. The shock must have been physical, a punch to the gut that sucked the air out of the room. Bryce was no longer a linebacker. He was a trapped animal. The shame of the act, combined with the terrifying threat of public exposure, created a perfect storm of panic. He was 15. He couldn't process the long-term reality that this was a scam. He could only see the immediate, catastrophic end of his social life. Bryce's fingers likely trembled as he typed his reply. Denial, begging, bargaining. Please don't do this. Why are you doing this? The extortionists didn't care. They operated on volume and speed. They demanded $500. To a working adult, $500 is a bill. To a 15-year-old high school student, it is a fortune. It is an impossible sum. The extortionists provided instructions on how to pay, Cash App, gift cards, crypto, methods that are instant and irreversible. They applied pressure, setting a timer. You have 10 minutes. The artificial urgency is a key component of the scheme. It deprives the victim of the time needed to think rationally, to breathe, or to go downstairs and tell a parent. Bryce checked his accounts. He checked his wallet. He didn't have the money. In a desperate attempt to make the nightmare stop, he offered them everything he had. I only have $30, he typed. Please take it. It's all I have. It was a heartbreaking offering, the total net worth of a sophomore. But the predators were ruthless. $30 wasn't enough to satisfy the quota they likely needed to meet. They mocked the offer. They increased the threats. They began to send him screenshots of the send button hovering over his mother's Facebook profile or his basketball coach's Instagram. They were tightening the noose, showing him that his destruction was just one click away. It was now late afternoon, the sun fully gone. Downstairs, perhaps the television was on, or dinner was being prepped, the sounds of safety just a flight of stairs away. But Bryce was locked in a silent war zone. The 20-minute window that Adam Tate would later describe to the press had begun. The scammers, realizing the money wasn't coming, shifted tactics from extortion to pure psychological terrorism. If they couldn't get paid, they would inflict pain. The messages began to arrive in a torrent. One after another. Buzz. 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 I'm sending it now. Your life is over. Everyone will see. Look at this. Answer me. Answer me. 120 messages. That is one message every 10 seconds. It was a digital assault designed to induce tunnel vision. In survival psychology, tunnel vision occurs when the brain is overwhelmed by a threat, peripheral awareness vanishes, and the victim can only focus on the immediate danger. Bryce couldn't see his room anymore. He couldn't see the future where he graduated, or played varsity, or laughed about this stupid mistake in his 20s. He could only see the screen, the relentless scrolling text, the countdown, the shame. The cruelty of the sextortion rings is often underestimated. They are not just thieves. In their frustration, they can become sadistic. When Bryce failed to produce the $500 and the $30 was rejected, the rhetoric shifted to a final, devastating suggestion. They told him there was no way out. They told him his life was ruined anyway. Explicitly or implicitly, they planted the idea that the only way to stop the shame, the only way to prevent the photos from leaking, was to disappear. You should just kill yourself, they typed. Do it. For a brain still under development, the prefrontal cortex of a 15-year-old is not fully formed, specifically the area responsible for impulse control and long-term consequence assessment. This instruction can feel like a command. Bryce was exhausted, humiliated, and panicked. The logic of the adult world was inaccessible to him. He was alone in the silo of his phone. He believed them. He believed that his life, the one he had built with such care, was irretrievably broken. At precisely 7:10 p.m. on that Thursday evening, the comforting, predictable hum of the Tate household was violently severed by a noise that did not belong in a quiet home in Cross Lanes, West Virginia. It was a sound that defies the brain's ability to categorize it immediately, a sharp, percussive crack that seems to suck the air out of the room, followed by a ringing silence that is heavier and more terrifying than the noise itself. For Adam and Amanda Tate, who were downstairs navigating the mundane routines of a weeknight evening, the sound triggered a primal, biological alarm system that bypassed conscious thought entirely. It was the sound of a structural failure in their reality. In the split second after the report echoed from the second floor, time seemed to undergo a horrific dilation, stretching that single moment of recognition into an eternity of dread. The television, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of passing cars on Kelly Road, all of it faded into a gray static as their focus narrowed exclusively to the ceiling above them. There is a specific, suffocating terror that grips a parent when a noise of that magnitude originates from the direction of their child's sanctuary. It wasn't the sound of a falling object or a slammed door. It carried the unmistakable, flat reverberation of a gunshot, a sound that carries a frequency of violence that the human ear instinctively recognizes. They moved toward the stairs not with the speed of thought, but with the desperate, adrenaline-fueled propulsion of survival, their hearts hammering against their ribs with a force that was physically painful. The climb up the stairs was a journey through a nightmare, each step heavy with a denial that was already crumbling, their minds screaming prayers and bargains to a universe that had already made its move. The hallway was still, the shadows undisturbed, but the air tasted different, metallic, sharp, and charged with the aftermath of an irreversible event. When they pushed open the door to Bryce's bedroom, the visual reality slammed into them with the force of a physical blow, shattering the hopeful delusion that perhaps a shelf had fallen or a heavy object had dropped. The room, usually a testament to the vibrant, growing life of a teenage boy, filled with the smell of deodorant, the clutter of sports gear, and the scattered remnants of homework, had been transformed instantly into a crime scene. Bryce, the 15-year-old sophomore who had been the center of their world, the boy whose laughter had filled this house for a decade and a half, lay collapsed, his future extinguished in a microsecond of panic-induced despair. The shock of such a discovery induces a state of acute traumatic stress where the brain struggles to process the visual input. It is too large, too terrible to be real. Adam and Amanda were plunged into the deepest circle of parental hell, a place of screaming confusion and frantic, futile motion. They rushed to him, their hands shaking as they reached for a pulse, for warmth, for any sign that the nightmare could be rewound. But the cold finality of the act was undeniable. Amidst this scene of absolute devastation, unseen by the grieving parents who were blinded by tears and shock, lay the silent architect of the tragedy. Bryce's smartphone sat nearby, perhaps on the bed or the floor, its screen dark and innocent-looking. It gave no indication that it was hot to the touch, physically or digitally. It sat there like a black box recorder amidst the wreckage, holding the secret of the 120 messages that had driven a happy, athletic, well-loved boy to believe that his life was over. The weapon that had truly killed him wasn't just the gun, it was the data stored on that device, hidden behind a passcode, waiting to tell a story of manipulation so cruel it would eventually shock the world. The arrival of the first responders marked the transition of the Tate home from a private sanctuary of grief into a procedural theater of law enforcement. The first sign was the strobing blue lights cutting through the darkness of the West Virginia night, reflecting off the siding of the house and illuminating the leafless trees in stark, rhythmic flashes. The sirens wailing in the distance, and then cutting out abruptly as the cruisers pulled into the driveway, signaled the end of the family's privacy. Deputies from the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office moved with the practiced, somber urgency of men and women who have seen the worst of the human experience but must remain professionally detached. They entered the home, their boots heavy on the floorboards, bringing with them the crackle of radios and the distinct, authoritative presence of the state. For the officers, the scene was a code 10 to 56 or a similar designation for a suicide, a call that is dreadfully common yet always uniquely tragic. They had to navigate the raw, screaming grief of Adam and Amanda Tate, gently steering them away from the room that was now a biohazard scene, trying to impose order on a situation that was fundamentally chaotic. The house was taped off, the perimeter secured, and the curious neighbors, drawn by the commotion, were kept at bay. The atmosphere inside was thick with the bureaucratic weight of death investigation. Photographs were taken, measurements were made, and statements were collected from parents who could barely speak through their hyperventilation. The officers saw a tragedy, but at this stage, they likely viewed it through the conventional lens of teenage mental health, a hidden depression, a secret struggle, a snap decision. They did not yet know they were standing in the fallout zone of an international crime. However, the modern protocol for investigating an unattended death, particularly that of a juvenile, has evolved to recognize the central role of technology in modern life. The investigative team, led by seasoned professionals who understood that the physical scene is only half the story, turned their attention to the electronic devices in the room. The smartphone, lying where it had fallen, became the focal point of the evidence collection. It was not merely a personal effect. It was a potential witness. A deputy, wearing latex gloves to preserve latent fingerprints and DNA, carefully picked up the device. It was placed into a Faraday bag, a specialized evidence bag designed to block all incoming and outgoing wireless signals, preventing the device from being remotely wiped or altered by anyone on the outside. This action, performed with routine efficiency, was the single most critical step in the entire investigation. Had the phone been overlooked, or had the family simply kept it, the truth about the local girl and the extortion plot might have been buried with Bryce. As the medical examiner's team arrived to perform the grim task of removing Bryce's body, beginning the long, slow procession out of the house he grew up in, the deputies secured the phone in the back of a squad car. It sat there, a piece of hardware containing the digital venom that had poisoned a young mind, ready to be transported to the sterile, fluorescent-lit world of the digital forensic lab. The parents were left in the sudden, crushing silence of an empty house, unaware that the investigation was about to pivot from a suicide case to a relentless hunt for a predator. The Kanawha County Sheriff's Office Digital Forensic Lab acts as a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of a crime scene. It is a place of cool air, humming servers, and clinical detachment. When Bryce Tate's phone arrived, it was treated as a black box, a repository of truth that needed to be cracked open. Detective Jared Payne and the forensic specialists understood that in 2025, a teenager's phone is an external hard drive for their consciousness. To access it, they utilized advanced mobile forensic software, tools like Celebrite or Graykey, which are designed to bypass user locks and extract bit-for-bit copies of the device's memory. The process is technical and methodical. The phone was connected to the forensic workstation, and the software began the extraction phase, pulling everything from call logs and geolocation data to deleted caches and encrypted chat histories. As the progress bar crawled across the screen, the detectives waited, knowing that the answer to the question why lay somewhere in the gigabytes of data being harvested. They were looking for the usual suspects: bullying texts, depressing search histories, or notes. But what the extraction parsed out was something far more sinister, a pattern of data that pointed not to long-term depression, but to a sudden, acute, and externally inflicted trauma. The software reconstructed the digital timeline of November 6th, laying out the events of the afternoon with millisecond precision, creating a visual map of Bryce's final interactions. As Detective Payne began to review the parsed data, the narrative of the Sextortion plot revealed itself with horrifying clarity. The forensic view allowed the investigators to see the conversation exactly as Bryce had seen it, but with the added context of timestamps and metadata. They saw the initial friend request at 4:37 p.m., the friendly banter that lasted for roughly an hour, and the calculated grooming tactics used by the predator. They watched the tone shift at the moment the compromising image was sent. But what stopped the breath in their throats was the log of the final 20 minutes. The sheer volume of data transmission was staggering. The analysis showed a barrage of 120 incoming messages in a condensed window of time, a rate of fire that was relentless. The content of the messages was explicitly recovered. The demands for $500, the rejection of the $30 offer, the graphic threats to share the images with specific family members whose names had been scraped from Bryce's social graph, and finally, the directives to commit suicide. The forensic examiners could see the read receipts. They could see Bryce opening the messages, the pauses where he likely panicked, and the frantic, typing-aware indicators of his few, desperate replies. This was not a suicide in the traditional sense. The digital evidence proved it was a psychological siege. The metadata also revealed the IP addresses and routing information, pointing away from the local area and toward proxies that suggested an overseas origin, likely West Africa. The local girl was mathematically proven to be a fabrication, a digital puppet controlled by a syndicate. The lab had uncovered the smoking gun, transforming the tragedy into a verified homicide by proxy. The days following the discovery of the truth were a blur of agony and awakening for Adam Tate. The funeral service for Bryce was a harrowing event, a sea of black clothes and tear-streaked faces packed into the church. But for Adam, the grief was now laced with a radioactive fury. When the investigators sat him down and walked him through the forensic findings, showing him the logs, the threats, and the mechanical cruelty of the scam, the image of his son's death shifted. Bryce hadn't abandoned them. He had been cornered. He hadn't been weak. He had been overwhelmed by a sophisticated enemy that knew exactly which psychological buttons to press. This realization fundamentally altered Adam's mourning process. He could not simply retreat into silence and let his son be remembered as a boy who couldn't cope with life. He realized that silence was exactly what the predators counted on. Shame is the cloak under which sextortion schemes operate. If the parents stay quiet to protect their child's reputation, the scammers remain in the shadows, free to move on to the next username on the list. Adam made the excruciating decision to weaponize his grief. He decided to destroy the privacy that usually surrounds such deaths, sacrificing his own family's peace to blow the whistle on the crime. Adam's transition from a grieving father to a national advocate was swift and uncompromising. He stepped in front of the local and national news cameras, his face etched with sleeplessness, but his eyes burning with resolve. He did not mince words. He did not use the sanitized language of public relations. He looked into the lens and delivered the indictment that would headline the story. My son was murdered by godless demons. The phrase was shocking, biblical, and entirely appropriate for the moral void he had witnessed in those chat logs. He detailed the tunnel vision Bryce had experienced, explaining to the world how the scammers induce a state of panic so severe that the victim loses touch with reality. He held up the phone, metaphorically and literally, as the scene of the crime. He spoke to other parents not with platitudes, but with urgent warnings, telling them that their smart, athletic, good kids were just as vulnerable as anyone else. He attacked the platforms for allowing these predators to operate, and he demanded that law enforcement treat these cases not as cyber harassment, but as lethal threats. Adam Tate became the human face of the crisis, forcing the public to look at the uncomfortable reality of sextortion, ensuring that Bryce's death would not be a quiet statistic, but a deafening alarm bell. As the investigation into Bryce Tate's death expanded, it quickly outgrew the resources of the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office, moving up the chain to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI's involvement signaled a shift from a local tragedy to a federal case with international implications. Agents from the Pittsburgh field office, specializing in cybercrime and crimes against children, took custody of the digital evidence, integrating Bryce's case into a massive, sprawling mosaic of global organized crime. The 120 messages were no longer just evidence of one boy's death. They were a data point in a silent pandemic that the FBI and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had been tracking with growing alarm. The statistics were released to the public to underscore the scale of the threat. NCMEC reported over 33,000 cases of financial sextortion targeting minors in 2024 alone, a number that had skyrocketed from previous years. The investigators explained that these were not isolated incidents of cyberbullying, but were the work of industrial-scale criminal enterprises, often referred to as Yahoo Boys, operating out of internet cafes in Nigeria and other parts of West Africa. These groups use scripts, stolen photos, and psychological playbooks, refined over thousands of victims to extract money, with no regard for the human wreckage they left behind. The legacy of the case, however, extends far beyond the hunt for the perpetrators, who often remain shielded by international borders and jurisdictional complexities. The true impact of the story lies in the cultural shift it ignited. Bryce Tate's story, amplified by his father's relentless advocacy, forced a conversation that had been happening in whispers to be spoken aloud. Schools began holding assemblies specifically on sextortion. Police departments started issuing alerts detailing the friend request modus operandi, and parents began to look at their sons' gaming consoles and smartphones with a new, informed vigilance. The FBI released public safety announcements using the details of Bryce's case to illustrate the red flags, the rapid movement to private apps, the request for nudes, the immediate demands for money. The tragedy served as a grim inoculation for the community. Because Bryce died, other boys who found themselves in the same trap knew that they could survive the shame, that the threats were empty, and that they should go to their parents instead of the gun cabinet. The story closes not with a conviction in a courtroom, which may never come, but with the enduring image of a father standing in the gap, holding a light up to the dark web, ensuring that the 120 messages that killed his son were the last ones that specific ring would ever send without the world watching. Bryce Tate was 15. He was a sophomore, a linebacker with a gentle soul, the kind of kid who said, "Yes, ma'am," and lived for basketball. On November 6th, his phone buzzed. It was a friend request from a local girl. She knew his gym. She knew his school. It felt real. He trusted her. But the moment he sent a private photo in return for hers, the trap shut. The girl vanished. In her place were overseas criminals demanding $500 to keep his photo secret. Bryce only had $30. When he couldn't pay, the onslaught began. In the last 20 minutes of his life, they flooded his phone with 120 messages. Relentless threats, shaming him, telling him his life was over, urging him to end it. Overwhelmed by panic and tunnel vision, Bryce did it at 7:10 p.m. His father says his son wasn't depressed. He was hunted by godless demons. This is a silent pandemic. The predators are real, and they are in your home. Talk to your sons tonight. Tell them, if this happens, don't panic. Come to us. We can fix it. In memory of Bryce Tate, learn the signs. Break the silence.